Anyone have any questions that I can repeat? No? From yesterday? No. Okay. Good morning. Hope everyone got a good sleep. Was less jet lagged than I was yesterday. So, okay. So I'm going to talk today. The game plan is I'm going to talk about a paper by Kate Ho on hospital contracting between hospitals and insurance plans, and then I'm going to hand off to Robin, who's going to do the rest of the talking about the vertical markets. Okay? Okay, so actually I'm glad I have a chance. I didn't necessarily think I was going to have time to talk about this paper, but I'm glad that I will. And it's kind of, I teach this paper often, and to be honest, I actually often struggle with it. And I struggle with what to say about it. And, we'll see in the end, the reasons I struggle are, partly that it's kind of at the end of the day not entirely clear what the question is. And second, it's not entirely clear, somehow the model, somehow it doesn't 100% hang together. But at the same time, there's a lot of things that are interesting about the paper, and it's the one paper. Actually, I guess we could say, in a sense, Villas-Boas was a non-cooperative approach. It just had some very extreme models that it was looking at, but it's the one paper that's kind of taking a more non-cooperative approach to these bargaining games, kind of like in the offer game and the bidding game that we looked at. And so I think in that sense, it's quite it's interesting to look at, and I think there are questions about to what extent, what has happened is following Ali, where are you? Following Ali's paper back, with Greg Crawford, the literature has followed that Ali's paper, Crawford and Urugulu paper, and gone down this path, the empirical literature, down this Nash and Nash path, and then. With generalizations and extensions, for example, the paper of Robin and Kate Ho's that I mentioned yesterday, but it kind of hasn't continued on this non-cooperative direction. I think there's questions about whether there's something fruitful to still do in that direction. So, the big set, and I should say it was kind of one of the early papers. Basically, the two early papers on this that kind of got this literature going. One was Sophia's paper and the other's Kate's. So, all right, so there's hospitals who are the kind of, you can think of as input suppliers to insurance plans. Insurance plans sell insurance contracts to consumers, okay? So what they do is they contract with hospitals, this is in the US, to form networks. If you sign up for an insurance plan in the US, there's a set of hospitals that you can go to. This depends a little bit on the type of insurance plan, but for insurance plans, some insurance plans you can go anywhere, the point of service plans, but other insurance plans like HMOs or PPO plans, they're called, you have to choose, when you sign up for your plan, there are some hospitals that get covered, other hospitals don't, or they get covered at worse terms, where you're paying a bigger share. So a really big issue for consumers when they're thinking about the plan, about what insurance plan to buy or sign up for, is what's the network of hospitals? Do I like that network? Is it near me? Do I think that those hospitals have high quality, et cetera? Okay, so that's a really big issue. So here, it's kind of just with little lines drawn, these contracting relations you can think of. Blue as contracts that get signed, and red as contracts that don't get signed. So potentially not every hospital is in every plan. Okay? So this is actually from Kate's paper. Up here on the top, we can just focus on the top half. It just shows on the horizontal axis, this is just a histogram of the different plans she gathered data on, insurance plans, at how many in the city that the plan covered, how many major hospitals were excluded. So you can see there's a range of different outcomes. In some plans, every hospital, local hospital, is included, but there are also plans where a number of the major hospitals are not included. Okay. Yeah.
So this then shows that majority of the plans do cover most of, because the main mass is at the beginning, 0, 1.
Okay, the question was, does this show that the majority of the plans did cover all hospitals? And if you look at, I can't add up all these numbers instantaneously, but I would say it may not quite be the majority, but certainly a very large fraction did cover all. So this is 200 and...
No, so actually I was saying majority of the plans do cover majority of the...
Oh, well, this I can't actually tell you that because, sorry, repeat the question. This actually says that the majority of the plans do cover the majority of the hospitals, question mark. And my response was, I can't actually tell you that because I don't know how many major hospitals were in the city. This is only showing me how many were excluded. Okay.
So does this structure include Medicaid plans, because those might be required to be covered in every hospital?
Okay, the question is, does this data include Medicaid plans? And the answer is no. Medicaid plans are Medicaid is a public insurance program in the U.S. These are not. These are all private. Okay. 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 All right. So let me. This is. Sorry. Another question.
Is the consumer is free to choose between each plan?
Okay. Let me see if I can repeat the question. Is the consumer free to choose between each plan? Question mark. So that, I mean, so she has. I guess it depends. Some of these plans are probably employer plans that you may have a narrower set of plans that you're able to choose from. I'd have to go back and look exactly at the data set that she's using.
The employers might be the consumers.
I'm sorry?
The employers might be the consumers, and then the answer is yes.
Yeah, I mean, at some level, okay, sorry. That was a statement, not a question, so I don't know if I have to repeat it. The employers might be essentially the message from this statement was the employers you might think of as the consumers, and so they're choosing among all of the plans as you could think of as agents for their employees. Is that? Okay. True. So anyway, but typically in the U.S., either some people who have private insurance, they're choosing from any private insurance plan. Others are at an employer. A lot of health insurance in the U.S. is employer-based. The employer chooses some set of plans to offer employees. Sometimes the employees then have no choice. Other times they have a choice between 2 or 3 or 4 plans. For example, at the university, I have a choice between 3 different plans, as an example. Is that okay? Okay. So just to give you a sense of the data that she has, and so she has basically premium information and the number of enrollees that signed up. So there are different. I already alluded to this briefly. There are HMO plans in the U.S. which are very restricted set of hospitals. There are point of service plans, that's POS, that have kind of different tiers of hospitals, and so you can go to an out-of-network hospital, but you have to pay more. And then, sorry, that's a PPO. A PO, I should have said, maybe I'm reversing this. Hospital networks. Yeah, so I guess maybe I'm reversing this, the terminology. So POS plans, I think you're restricted, and the PPO plans are fairly unrestricted. I'm getting this messed up.
I think my indemnity plan can go anywhere.
Yeah, but there's a distinction between the POS and the PPO plans about the restrictiveness, and sorry?
POS.
Okay. Yeah, so that's why it's combined here with the HMO thing. All right, so All right. In any case, so she collects data she has data on premiums and the number of enrollees that sign up for these kind of more restrictive plans in 43 markets. For 2002, she has plan quality measures from this organization that surveys consumers. She has information about the hospital networks that these plans have. This is collected, for a nearby time period in 2003. She has hospital characteristics from 2001. And she has information on admissions to hospitals in 1997 and 98 for individuals that are covered by 50 employer plans. Those particular ones were employer plans. So the main thing actually I wanted you to get from this, which is, and those of you who have studied in IO have no doubt seen this, is the data here is kind of cobbled together from a bunch of different places. It took a lot of effort to do it. So you'll see this in various papers of, trying to get data from various sources to kind of complete the information that you need to start estimating a model. And maybe it's not, ideally you'd have, the same, data on the same set of hospital admissions for these same plans in the same time period, and it would all be absolutely perfect. Sometimes it's not totally 100% perfect, okay? All right, so it's kind of useful to think, like, what's the difference between Villas-Boas and this paper, and just as a comparison, since we talked about it yesterday. So there's things that are like Villas-Boas and there's things that are different. So, one thing that's like Villas-Boas is she doesn't observe anything about the contracts between the hospitals and the plans, okay? Or the contracting process. And similar to Villas-Boas, she observes a downstream outcome of that contracting process, namely which hospitals are in network and which are not for a plan, okay? What's different, number one, a smaller thing is she observes hospital costs. So, and I say sort of here because maybe we don't think it's the absolute best measure, but there's a measure of, per admission, what's the cost at hospital number one, what's the cost at hospital number two. Villas-Boas didn't. She observed production, per unit costs. She had just input costs that contributed to what the actual production costs were.
Where does the data on hospital costs come from?
It's one of the hospital characteristics, I think, from the AHA, I think, if I remember. I didn't, yeah. The reason I'm not 100% sure, and this thing about POS and PPO, which I always flip around, is I didn't think I was going to cover this, so I didn't look back at the paper before today. So, but I think it's from here, from the AHA. And then one thing that's also unlike Villas-Boas is she observes this downstream outcome, but she's using different information than Villas-Boas about the downstream outcome. So she's basically using, whether you're carried or in network of hospitals. Villas-Boas instead was using prices charged for the hospital in the supermarket. Okay, Villas-Boas could have done something about, basically carrot, essentially the same thing in that, like, is Dan and Sherry yogurt in Dominic's market or not, right? That would have been the equivalent thing. Villas-Boas didn't use that. Here, you could have used something about, in principle, about the premia, but it's not really getting used in the same way here. The one thing I would say is premium information is, so there are two things to notice about that. One is, the carriage decision is much coarser information than premium decision, right? The premium is this continuous variable that's telling you something in Villas-Boas about what the marginal cost of the retailer is.
She probably doesn't know premiums because half is...
Who?
I mean, it's not knowable. It's if they're contracts with firms. Premium is different for every firm. There's not.
So she is doing something. She's estimating demand.
I don't know what she does. The question, what is doing? She looks at premium, but That's part of the
So, I mean, I think in this setting, the premium is much less useful than in Villas-Boas because Villas-Boas, you're charging a price for Dan and Cherry yogurt. Here, you're charging a price for basically an insurance plan that has a number of hospitals in it. And so it's sort of like, Robin's going to talk about cable TV, and it's a lot like cable TV. Like, how much information is there in the price getting charged to the consumer about one particular hospital or one particular channel, right? So it's going to be much less useful here. In Villas-Boas, there's a lot more information in the price that you see at retail about what what you're not seeing about the terms. Did you have a question, Eric? Okay. Okay, so it's just useful to contrast like what the difference is in what's being used to learn about these unobserved contract terms. Okay, so what's the model? All right, so I'm not going to go into this is going to be a little bit of a helicopter view of the model because the model actually has a lot of parallels to the model that's used in the cable TV papers that Robin's going to talk about. Okay, so I'm going to describe it at a high level without going in, showing you the slide of all the details that would take us 15 minutes. Okay, all right, so there are basically 5 stages. Stage 1, hospitals make private offers of 2-part tariffs to plans. Okay, so remember we have hospitals, we have plans, and the hospitals you can think of as simultaneously making offers to each plan. Okay, and those offers are assumed to be 2-part tariffs. Okay, stage 2, and I should say they're private offers. Okay, stage, yeah.
What is a 2-part plan?
Sorry. That's why I had this here. So what's going to, basically it's a fixed fee and a per unit charge. Okay? So in the per unit charge here is per admission. Later papers on contracting with hospitals are going to tend to do things instead based on what are called DRG units, which are diagnostic units. So like some things are more severe treatment, intensive treatment than others. But in this paper, it's per admission. So think of it as a fixed fee, okay? And what's actually going to happen, I was going to put this up later, is it's going to get modeled as a function of characteristics of the hospital and the plan and some parameters, plus, so what's going to get paid to the hospital is this fixed fee, say per year, plus, let's call it a marginal charge, which also is going to be a function of characteristics and parameters times, let's say, the number of admissions, call it X, from plan. Well, I won't put subscripts, but whatever, the number of admissions that are made of enrollees in that plan into that hospital. So that's what I mean by a 2-part tariff. I didn't repeat your question. I'm sorry. The question was, what does he mean by a 2-part tariff? Hopefully you inferred that already from the answer. Other questions? Yeah.
So I see now that there's both consumers and employers in the model.
No, well, consumers and employers. Then it's not. Basically, it's really, think of it as consumers.
Okay. And the second question. So I guess it's always insurance.
I didn't repeat that either. Sorry.
I'm speaking loudly.
Did everybody hear his question? All right.
So you purchase. So there's like a disconnect between the price you pay and the quantity.
Let me
you
explain.
get, right?
Let me explain. I'm getting there.
Okay.
The helicopter view will include an answer to your question. Okay. So since it will, I don't have to repeat the question. All right. So. All right, so let me just go through the 5 stages, and then if we have questions about it, you can ask me. All right, so hospitals make these private offers of 2-part tariffs to the plans. The plans observe these private offers. The assumption is going to be they have passive beliefs, okay, and they basically choose whether to accept or reject the hospital's offers, okay. Plans then set premiums. one question you could ask, and actually I didn't, as I said, I didn't have a chance to look back at the paper, is what's the assumption, and I think it's actually just implicit, about what's then observed about the prices that rival hospitals are facing, the marginal costs that rival hospitals face with the contracts that they've signed. I think the assumption implicitly is they're still private. So you just have beliefs about what everybody else's contracts and their marginal costs are. Okay, so that's, and so the plans, once they've got their networks, they simultaneously do a Nash equilibrium in offering premiums. Consumers decide, then seeing the premiums and the networks and the characteristics of each plan, decide which plan they want to sign up for. Okay, and then after they've signed up for plans, they may get sick and have to go to the hospital. And when they get sick and have to go to the hospital, they choose which hospital to go to. Okay, and so basically, and the assumption here that is that when they choose what to go, the way it's modeled. Okay, so now I'll just tell you a little bit about the details. The way it's modeled, it's when you choose which hospital to go to, basically there's no price variable, but you care about things like distance to the hospital and things like that. So basically, later papers have kind of worried a little bit, have kind of tried to include what your copay is and stuff like that. Generally, it's small and doesn't have a big effect. But at this point, in this literature at that time, the price kind of was not considered, and it was just like, where do I want to go of the ones I'm allowed to go to? All right, so then so that's the timing of the model. The way to think about what's happening is in stage 5, consumer choice is kind of, consumers are looking forward to which hospitals they're going to potentially go to if they're sick. So you can think, what they do is in stage 4, when they're thinking about their plans, they look at the hospital network of a given plan. They do the computation of, okay, what's the probability I'm going to get various diseases, conditional on each disease, where am I going to want to go? And then we're going to calculate what our expected utility is of signing up for that plan. Once we calculate that expected utility, that is the value of the bundle of hospitals that are getting offered to you, then having done that calculation for each plan and seen the premiums that each plan is offering, as well as their quality rating and everything else, you decide, okay, which plan do you want? That's stage 4. Okay, so consumers in stage 4 are kind of doing the calculation, looking ahead at stage 5 to decide what plan to buy. Okay, so from stages, given the premiums that are set, she estimates demand. Okay, basically estimating this part of the model. That actually it's reported in this paper. There's actually a previous paper that she also had that kind of was the paper about demand. And then this paper is kind of more focused on this part of the model, given the demand estimation. Okay. So as I mentioned, the bargaining model is take it or leave it. You can think of it as take it or leave it offers by hospitals, and plans have passive beliefs when they get those offers. Okay? Now, what she's going to do is assume, I've kind of already alluded to this, she's going to assume a functional form for the two-part tariff. Okay? And in particular, she's going to end up assuming that the two-part tariff takes some functional form for every relationship that gets signed. Okay? And basically the empirical exercise is going to be estimating the parameters of it. Okay? So, one thing that's a little, I always have a little bit of a hard time wrapping my head around, or mind around, is, what do I think about the fact that it's this parametric form that's applying to all relationships? And I'll talk about that a little bit. B, what she's estimating is actually an equilibrium outcome. Like normally when we have a structural model, you think of yourself as like estimating some underlying structural parameters. That's not what's happening here. She's estimating kind of an equilibrium outcome. And that's going to have an implication for, like, at the end of the day, what are you going to do with this? Because, like, if you were thinking about counterfactuals, Like, do you think this thing is going to stay the same? Like, if there was if there was a merger, okay, of hospitals, or if there was a change in costs, like this thing, it's kind of like a Lucas critique. Like this thing, you would think would change, okay? And another way to actually put this and think about it is to say, okay, once you've estimated demand, and if you're telling me costs, hospital costs, and you're telling me it's a private offer game, okay, with passive beliefs, at least if equilibrium is unique, I should be able to tell you what the outcome is. I should be able to tell you what this contract will be, okay? And actually, it's not going to be this. And coming back to something that came up yesterday, what it's going to be is that this marginal charge should be equal to marginal cost of the hospitals. Hospitals should be collecting everything in F.
Can I say something in defense?
So Ariel has a question. He's asking, can he say something in defense? Okay. So this is a good thing about an advisor. Your advisor should always be in your corner. Ariel was Kate's advisor, so.
I mean, I think the reason for doing this is seeing what were the variables that should be in the right model. So she's going to put in systems, whether the hospital is in a system, and does that affect the premium, stuff like that, which people cared about for figuring out how to build the next model, the next generation of models. As well.
Yeah. So I guess the question is, I haven't quite seen a next generation at some level. So, the funny thing is, as I said, like if this is a little bit of the disconnect is estimating this equilibrium thing, which actually isn't the equilibrium of the wouldn't be the equilibrium of this model in the end. So we'll see. It's not perfect. Right. So that's also why I said, I think there's a lot of stuff that's interesting here. Right? And so, anyway, so I think it's interesting to talk about the paper, while at the same time talking about, one way to put it, I said at the beginning, I always struggle to when I teach this paper, and part of, it's partly exactly how to think about everything that's being done and going on. Okay. So, what is she going to do? Here's another piece that's quite interesting about the paper. So she wants to estimate, what's the equilibrium two-part tariff that's getting offered? What is she going to do? She's going to use moment inequalities. Okay, so everyone has this two-part tariff thing in mind. Okay, so let's take a simple. We have hospital 1 and hospital 2, say, market. And suppose we have two plans, P1 and P2. So she's going to use two, basically, two necessary conditions of the equilibrium in this model. Okay, so suppose hospital 1 is making an offer to plan 1, and the two hospitals are making offers to both plans. Okay. So one thing that has to be true is that given the offer that's made to the plan by hospital 1, the plan and the plan is accepting it. We see in the data the plan has included hospital 1. It has to be true that plan 1 doesn't want to just reject it instead. So that's the first necessary condition, that each plan with each hospital that's in its network prefers to accept it rather than reject it. And that's just a straightforward, so that's number one. And that, given passive beliefs, the way you would want to do that is quite straightforward. And it's not even you're offered this plan, you know what everybody else's offers are in equilibrium, and the question is just, do you accept or not? And if you don't, everybody else's acceptance decisions are what you see in the data, okay? And if you were accepting hospital 2, you certainly can still accept hospital 2. So what we're going to do is just ask, is this plan better or worse off accepting hospital 1 than just erasing it and dropping it? Okay, that's straightforward. The other thing is, Hospital 1 has to be better off making that offer to Plan 1 than instead not making the offer at all. Okay? Now, this is more complicated because one issue question is, all right, if Hospital 1 doesn't make an offer to Plan 1, what will Plan 1 do? Now, we know it has passive beliefs, so it's continuing to think that Hospital 1 is making the same offer to Plan 2. But it might change its decisions with other hospitals. Now, in this case, if it was accepting Hospital 2 to start with, Hospital 2 is the only, I drew here, is the only other hospital in the market, it's probably going to continue to accept it. But imagine there are other hospitals that it was rejecting initially. When it doesn't get an offer from Hospital 1, it may now accept them. Okay. So one question is like, okay, what do you do with this? How do you figure out, like, for Hospital 1 to think, when Hospital 1 is thinking, what if I don't make this offer? And thinking, well, is my payoff going up or down from doing that? It has to think about what Plan 1's reaction will be. And how do we figure that out? Okay. In the main analysis in the paper, Kate assumes that the Hospital 1 thinks Plan 1 won't change any of its other acceptance and rejection decisions, which doesn't really fit the model. But she also does something, as you know, in the extensions, which kind of does fit the model, and it makes a really nice use of the moment inequality framework, which is, namely, one thing that has to be true is that Hospital 1 has to be better off making the offer than not making the offer if Plan 1 then changes its decisions with all, accept, reject decisions in the worst possible way for Hospital 1. Okay? So that's when I say she considers two possible assumptions, the second of those, which actually shows up in the extensions, not in the main thing, is does fit the model correctly, and is also just a very nice use of the moment inequalities. Okay, I guess one thing you could ask is like, could you get a lot more power out of trying to do something that was more precise about what the actual response would be? So at the end of the day, she's estimating what the offers are from a dysfunctional form from other hospitals. So you could actually start trying, given that functional form, to say what the response would be. Okay, but she doesn't do that. But what she does is, I think, a very nice use of the moment inequalities. Okay, so what's identifying, the functional form that I had up here before is basically she's assuming this parametric form. And that parametric form has to, in essence, leave positive gains from trade for all the positive gains from trade for all the relationships she does see formed, and negative gains from trade for the ones for one of the two agents, hospital or plan, in the relationships she doesn't see formed. Okay, and that's kind of what's driving this estimate. That this functional form has to kind of manage to, when the model is predicting what the gains from trade are for each plan and hospital pair matching up, and for the ones we see happening, the functional form has to basically split the difference, in the sense of giving each side a positive gain. Yeah.
I have one question on the previous slide. On the stage 4, does she, when she models this consumer response through different plans, does she take into account complementarities between?
Does she take into a plan?
The complementarities between different hospitals in the same plan, for example. Like if she lives, like consumer lives close to some set of hospitals, consumer prefer to choose the plan that contains all these hospitals.
Okay, let me see if I can repeat. So the question is, when she is modeling consumer choice here, is she considering complementarities between as networks form between different hospitals? So it's certainly the case that she's considering the value of the bundle, and of a bundle of hospitals in this calculation of like, if I get sick, with a certain diagnosis, where will I go? And it's certainly the case that it's certainly the case that, for some diagnoses, one hospital may be valuable, and for other diagnoses, another hospital might be valuable. The one thing that I'm hesitating about is I'm not sure, like, if you actually look at the demand structure, whether, like, it's complementarities in the formal sense. Like, is the value of the network, your incremental value of adding a hospital, complementarities would say, the incremental value of adding hospital A is bigger once you have hospital B in than without. And I'm not sure that's true in the demand estimate, like in the structure that's being estimated. So it may be that there's still substitutes, even with this different diagnosis thing, right? So it could be that hospital A is like great for cancer and bad for heart attacks. Hospital B is great for heart attacks and bad for cancer, but still hospital B's value is small, or incremental value is smaller if you have hospital A in, because at least you have something for I forget which way I did heart attacks and cancer. But, so anyway, so I'm not sure that it's complementarities. All right. So, okay, so that's kind of the identification thing. And just some notes about that. We've kind of hit on some of this. One is, notice the restricted two-part tariff form, is restrictive. Just doing the two-part, assuming a two-part tariff is restrictive, but it's certainly more general than in Villas-Boas, where we had linear per unit prices. Okay. I've mentioned, the parametric contract terms are being made to apply across all pairs, and that's quite important for this identification, right? That the idea, this whole idea of that this parametric form has to split the gain, give positive gains for all of the pairs that form. The same parametric form has to apply across different market situations. And one other thing to just note is very little, in some sense, very little of the model is getting used. It's just, very simple, relatively simple necessary conditions about are there gains from trade for each side. And the model has many more implications about the form of the optimal contract. As I was saying earlier, if you actually looked at the model, you'd conclude that the marginal price has to be equal to the hospital's marginal cost. And that's not getting used here at all. Yeah.
I hope this isn't too strange question. It seems like we're estimating something very, very specific. So it's a specific set of hospitals that are good at specific things, and a specific set of consumers that are afraid that they will have specific kinds of illnesses. So what is the, how's it called in English? Outside...
the external validity.
External validity, thank you.
Well, we're I/O economists, so we look at very specific things. And we hope that the lessons we learn generalize. So, I think, when we're looking at a particular market, we are, trying to learn things about that market, but we also hope that the things we learn will generalize, right? So, at the same time, this is a huge part of the economy, okay?
But
right?
this is not the whole. It's like a few hospitals, right? Or
In 43 cities, right?
Oh, okay.
So it's not just
So
like
it's just a big chunk of the healthcare market.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, and the healthcare market's a really big part of GDP.
Yeah,
So
that's
right. So Ariel likes to have this what share of GDP test is it for even though it's specific, it's is it yogurt? Last night at dinner, is it yogurt or is it hospitals? The hospital's more important. Okay, so, but then we had a debate about, yogurt might help you and keep you out of the hospital. So, all right. So this is what she estimates in the end, just to give you a flavor. The parameters. So one thing, here are the fixed components F are modeled as, depending on whether the hospital is in a system of hospitals, and I forget exactly what drop same hospitals means. And then there's various things about the per unit charge. So one thing I highlighted here is how much more per admission if you're a star hospital, so in Boston, for example, Mass General and Brigham and Women's are star hospitals, teaching hospitals associated with Harvard Medical School. So a hospital like that is estimated per admission to be able to charge, this is in thousands, $6,700 more per admission than if it wasn't a star hospital. And that's like, so her results are kind of about, well, she would say the equilibrium form tells you that star hospitals earn more. So it's worthwhile investing in becoming a star hospital, for example, okay? That would be I guess, one kind of conclusion from this. So just a last slide, just some thoughts about this. There's both some like narrow things to kind of ask yourself and some broader things. One is, why are we, estimating this parametric two-part tariff? Like, is that the right way to go here? If you're trying to do some non-cooperative model. I already said, like, okay, it doesn't necessarily, fit with what would be the equilibrium of like the model that's getting assumed, number one. But number two, what about the parametric thing? And one thing it implies is because you're doing this parametric thing, there are some relationships that actually do have some positive gains from trade, but but the model would predict don't happen. Because, basically there's positive gains from trade of, hospital I having in the network of plan J, but this parametric form doesn't split the difference in it and give both sides a positive return, okay? So do you think those things wouldn't form, or, how do you kind of explain that? So, and one question, once you say that, you could start asking yourself, well, suppose I didn't assume it was a parametric form. In some sense, I was trying to estimate say that each pair negotiated what was their, an optimal contract for them, which is a little more like the direction this, the Nash and Nash literature has gone. In that case, what you would expect to see, at least with complete information, is every deal that has positive gains from trade should form. And then what would, then you should sort of ask yourself, if you're just using network formation as your information, how would that tell you about what the contract form is? And the answer, I think the answer is that basically a contract, a given pair's formation would actually not tell you about their contracts, that pair's contract. It would tell you something about other pairs' contracts. Because the gains from trade from, say of me, if Ariel's a hospital and I'm a plan, of the two of us forming, whether we have gains from trade, will depend on what my contract terms are with Robin's hospital. Okay, so that would be actually the kind of information that would be in network formation. Broader level, I kind of have said this already, like, okay, what was the question here? I guess, we learned star hospitals earn more, okay, or get more. That's, one thing. One thing that is a little funny when you read the paper, there's a lot of thing in the beginning, those charts that I showed you about the networks being incomplete. Not all hospitals in the network is seems like it's a motivator of, one of the motivation is an interesting fact that kind of seems to motivate the paper, but at the end of the day, it's not clear that we're getting insights about why some hospitals are excluded. I mean, I guess if you took as given this is the two-part tariff, then that's your answer. It doesn't split the difference for those pairs, but I'm not sure that, again, that we quite understand why some hospitals aren't in there. In these networks. And then the last thing just to kind of ask yourself is, I kind of alluded to this also, is to what extent, if you wanted to think about counterfactuals, a merger or other things, to what extent does this give you, a model you can use for that? And, there are two aspects of this. One is like what's getting estimated is this endogenous thing, and we think it would change. And the other has a little bit to do with moment inequalities, and, we're using fairly weak necessary conditions, but to calculate equilibrium, you would want to be making use of more than that, right? Anyway, so I think there's a lot of interesting things here, and a question is there a direction to go from this? After you see all this Nash and Nash stuff, is there a direction to go kind of in this non-cooperative direction? So, you had a Question?
So, I wonder how good of a approximation is this parametric form, and if we can think of the gains from trade from the missing relationship as a kind of a test to validate how good the approximation is.
Okay.
Are they large, quantitatively large, or marginal, and in this case maybe it's good enough?
Yeah. Okay, the question is, how good or an approximation is this parametric form? And, is there a way of judging that by looking at, contracts that don't form? Do they seem to have, given my comment about these, that some relationships that have positive gains from trade don't form with this in the way this is being done? Maybe if we looked and we saw, are there huge gains from trade, we'd start to kind of be concerned that maybe it doesn't explain, something is amiss at some level.
Or the contrary, if they're small.
If they're small, maybe
it's very good.
we feel okay and it's doing a pretty good job. I think, yeah, that's interesting. And I don't know the answer to that. Another thing, like as you asked your question, I was kind of thinking is, imagine you had a data set where you actually did know what the contracts were. Like if you did, but if you did this on that data set and then looked at how it compared, that could be interesting to see how well something like this does. So, another question.
Wouldn't you like to, I don't know, see what is the result of the robust for if you change the two-part tariff, so the consumer pays also the marginal or the for admissions price? I mean, there is kind of externalities, whereas I, a consumer, once I pay for the plan, I can go whenever I want to the hospital, maybe I go to one.
Right. Okay. So the question was, wouldn't I like to look at what effect it would have if we introduce, if consumers faced had to pay to go to the hospital rather than choosing for free to go to different ones? That was the question. I would love to do that. No. Yeah. So yes, I think one big thing in hospital networks is there are externalities, and consumers are not making necessarily the right decisions. So, for example, a big issue in whether to include a hospital in your network that's, if it's high cost, is consumers, if they're not paying, might decide to go to the high cost hospital that, is near them, even though it's incredibly expensive compared to some other hospital that's a little further away. So, a big issue for plans is trying to incentivize consumers to make those choices well. The other side of this, of course, in insurance is there's this trade-off. There's moral hazard, and one aspect of moral hazard is what hospital do you decide to go to. But there's also insurance, and you want to insure people. So to the extent that you're making them pay a bunch to go to the hospital, you're not necessarily giving them as much insurance. So, there's questions about how to design insurance to try to do that well. So, other questions? Okay, so I've gone 6 minutes over, but I'm going to hand this off to Robin now. So.